Princess Zarathel's ship materialized in Europa's orbit 12 hours after Jake's initial contact, appearing from hyperspace with the elegant silence that marked advanced alien technology. Her vessel was beautiful in the same way as the crashed ship they had discovered, all flowing curves and crystalline surfaces that seemed to bend light around them. Jake and Sarah had spent those 12 hours studying the carvings more carefully and exploring the wreckage. They had found clear evidence that the creature had been living in the ship recently. Massive sleeping areas lined with what appeared to be collected metals and crystals, arranged in patterns that suggested both comfort and ritual significance. More importantly, they had discovered a trail leading away from the ship. The creature had left, and recently. The tracks were no more than 2 days old, heading deeper into Europa's unexplored regions, where the ice gave way to vast cavern systems that honeycombed the moon's interior. When Princess Zarathel's shuttle touched down near the crash site, Jake got his first look at an alien royal. She was indeed tall and elegant, standing nearly 2.5 meters in height with skin that held a faint luminescence and eyes that shifted color like opals. Her movements carried the grace of someone born to command, but there was an underlying tension that spoke of centuries of worry and loss. "You have found Thyrendal's refuge," she said, her voice carrying musical harmonics that made translation feel like listening to poetry. "I can feel his presence here even though he has departed." "Before we go any further," Sarah said diplomatically, "maybe you could tell us exactly what we're dealing with. Your companion is obviously not a normal animal, and from what we've seen, the relationship between you two is pretty significant." Zarathel approached the carvings on the wall, running her fingers over the images with obvious affection. "These are his work. Thyrendal was always artistic, always trying to capture memories in permanent form." She paused at the image showing their separation. "This shows the day I lost him." She turned to face the two humans, and they could see pain in her expression that transcended species differences. "To understand Thyrendal, you must understand the Valen. We are not like your human families. We do not reproduce as you do, nor do we form bonds through genetics or marriage. Jake," and Sarah listened intently as she explained, "a concept that challenged their understanding of relationships and consciousness. When a Valen reaches maturity, we undergo the bonding. Our minds reach out across space and time to find another consciousness that resonates with our own. Sometimes this consciousness belongs to another Valen. Sometimes it belongs to a completely different species. The bond once formed is deeper than love, stronger than blood, more essential than life itself." "And Thyrendal is your bonded companion," Sarah said, beginning to understand. "He is my other half," Zarathel confirmed. 357 years ago, when I was still young by my people's standards, my mind reached across the galaxy and found his. He was alone on a world where his kind had been hunted to near extinction, the last of an ancient species that your people would recognize as dragons." She moved to another carving that showed the first meeting between princess and dragon. "I traveled to his world and offered him partnership, not ownership, not domestication, but true equality. Together we explored the galaxy, learned from countless civilizations, and became more than either of us could have been alone." Jake studied the carvings, showing their adventures. "What happened? Why did you separate?" Zarathel's expression darkened. "The Scourge Wars. A mechanical race from beyond the galactic rim began conquering and destroying everything in their path. They converted organic life into resources for their endless expansion. My people called for every bonded pair to contribute to the war effort." The carvings showed images of the mechanical beings Jake and Sarah had seen in the earlier pictures. Now they understood these weren't random monsters, but part of a larger conflict that had raged across the galaxy. "Thyrendal and I fought together for decades. He was magnificent in battle. His breath could melt the strongest metals. His scales deflected energy weapons. And his intelligence allowed him to outthink machines that calculated thousands of possible outcomes per second." Pride filled her voice, but also terrible sadness. "During the final battle of the war, we discovered the Scourge's central command facility. Destroying it would end their invasion, but someone had to stay behind to ensure the destruction was complete. The facility's defenses would prevent escape." Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized where the story was heading. "I was prepared to sacrifice myself," Zarathel continued, "but Thyrendal would not allow it. He used our bond against me, overwhelming my mind with his love and determination while he carried me to the escape ships. By the time I recovered enough to fight back, he had already returned to the facility. She showed them the final battle in the carvings, the dragon fighting alone against impossible odds while his princess was carried away to safety. The facility was destroyed. The scourge was defeated. But Thyrendal, she paused, collecting herself. I felt him die through our bond. The pain of that loss nearly killed me as well. Jake frowned. But if he died, how is he here now? That is what I have been trying to understand for 3 centuries, Zarathel replied. 50 years ago I began sensing traces of our bond again. Faint at first, like echoes of memories, but gradually growing stronger. Something that felt like Thyrendal was alive again, somewhere in the galaxy. She explained how she had spent decades following those traces, traveling from system to system, world to world, always finding signs that someone matching Thyrendal's description had been there, but always arriving too late. The trail led me here to your solar system, but when I arrived I discovered something that should be impossible. The energy signature I was following wasn't just similar to Thyrendal's. It was identical, down to the quantum level. Sarah's scientific mind raced with the implications. You think he somehow survived the explosion? I think something far stranger happened, Zarathel said. The facility we destroyed was conducting experiments with consciousness transfer and dimensional manipulation. I believe that when Thyrendal died, his consciousness was somehow preserved and transferred across space and time. She showed them readings from her ship's sensors. The energy signature here on Europa matches not just Thyrendal's life force, but also temporal distortions consistent with dimensional travel. I believe he has been traveling through space and time for centuries, lost and alone trying to find his way back to me. Jake looked at the fresh tracks leading away from the ship. And now he's somewhere in Europa's cave systems. Yes, but there is a complication, Zarathel said, her expression growing troubled. The dimensional travel, the separation from our bond, the centuries of isolation, these things will have changed him. He may not remember who he was or who I am. He may see me as a threat rather than a friend. Or he might see us as threats, Sarah pointed out, thinking about the size of those tracks and the implications of facing an angry, confused dragon in enclosed cave systems. That is why I need your help, Zarathel said. My people are scholars and diplomats. We have little experience with tracking or hunting, but you two have spent your lives pursuing dangerous creatures in hostile environments. You understand how to approach something that might attack first and ask questions later. Jake and Sarah exchanged glances. They had signed up for a routine hunting contract, tracking what they thought was an unusually large predator. Now they were being asked to help reunite an alien princess with her bonded dragon companion, who had been lost across centuries and dimensions. What's our approach? Jake asked, because despite the impossible nature of the situation, he could see the genuine love and desperation in the princess's expression. Some bonds transcended species, and this was clearly one of them. We follow the tracks, Sarah said, studying her scanner readings, but carefully. If he's confused and potentially hostile, we need to be ready for anything. Zarathel nodded. I have weapons that can subdue him without permanent harm, but only if we can get close enough. And I have this. She produced a crystalline device that pulsed with soft light, a resonance amplifier. If any part of his memory remains intact, this should help him remember our bond. Jake shouldered his pack, checking his equipment one more time. Then let's go find your dragon. As they prepared to enter Europa's cave systems, none of them could predict that they were about to encounter not just a lost dragon, but a creature that had been transformed by centuries of dimensional travel into something that retained all of Thyrendal's power while gaining abilities that defied understanding. The hunt for the ancient beast was about to become far more complicated than any of them imagined. The entrance to Europa's cave system was a gaping wound in the ice, large enough to accommodate a creature of Thyrendal's size, but ominous in its absolute darkness. Jake's headlamp beam disappeared into the depths without revealing any bottom or far wall, and the thermal readings from Sarah's scanner showed a maze of interconnected tunnels that stretched for kilometers in every direction. The tracks continue straight down the main passage, Sarah reported, studying the deep gouges in the ice floor. But there's something else. Energy readings are off the charts down there. Whatever he's been doing in these caves, it's generating massive amounts of power. Zarathel examined the entrance with a mixture of anticipation and concern. Thyrendal always had an affinity for places of power. Even as a young dragon, he could sense energy sources that others missed. But these readings, she paused, checking her own instruments. They're unlike anything in my databases. The cave system proved to be more than simple ice formations. As they descended following the clear trail left by the dragon's massive claws, they discovered that the tunnels had been modified. Crystalline formations that definitely weren't natural ice grew from the walls and ceiling, pulsing with the same soft light they had seen in Zarathel's technology. He's been building something, Jake realized, examining the crystal structures more closely. These aren't random. They're following a pattern. Sarah's scanner was practically humming with activity. The crystals are resonating with each other, creating some kind of network. The energy isn't just being generated down here. It's being organized, channeled into specific patterns. They had been walking for 2 hours when they encountered the first guardian. The creature that emerged from a side tunnel wasn't Thyrendal, but it was clearly related to dragonkind. About the size of a large horse with scales that shifted between deep purple and silver, it moved with predatory grace. But what made Jake reach for his weapon wasn't its size or obvious strength. It was the intelligence in its eyes. Zarathel, he said quietly, not taking his gaze off the creature. Dragons don't usually travel in packs, do they? No, she replied, her voice filled with wonder rather than fear. They're solitary creatures. Thyrendal was unique among his kind because he chose to bond with me rather than live alone. The smaller dragon regarded them with obvious curiosity, tilting its head in a manner that reminded Jake uncomfortably of a cat sizing up potential prey. Then it did something that surprised all three of them. It spoke. The words weren't in any language Jake or Sarah recognized, but Zarathel gasped in recognition. She responded in the same flowing musical tongue, and the dragon's posture immediately shifted from threatening to merely cautious. What did it say? Sarah asked. She asked why I carry the scent of the Forgotten One, Zarathel translated. I told her I am seeking my bonded companion, and she says the great teacher has been expecting me. Great teacher? Jake didn't like the sound of that. The smaller dragon spoke again, this time gesturing with one clawed forefoot toward the deeper tunnels. Zarathel's expression grew more confused with each exchange. She says there are others like her, that the great teacher found them across the galaxy and brought them here, dragons who were lost, alone, forgotten by their kind. He gave them purpose and belonging. Sarah's scanner detected movement in multiple side tunnels. We've got company. Multiple contacts, all roughly the same size as our new friend here. More dragons emerged from the crystal-lined passages. Each was unique in coloring and size, but all shared the same intelligence and purposeful bearing. Jake counted at least 8, though the shifting lights from the crystals made exact numbers difficult to determine. They're not aggressive, Zarathel observed, though she kept her hand near her weapon. Curious, yes, but not hostile. They're studying us. The first dragon spoke again, this time at greater length. As she listened, Zarathel's expression shifted from confusion to amazement, to something approaching awe. She says the great teacher told them I would come, that he has been preparing for this moment for decades, but... She paused, struggling to translate concepts that apparently didn't exist in human language. She says he is not as he was. The journey through the void between spaces changed him. He remembers the past, but lives in many times at once. Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with Europa's temperatures. What does that mean? I think it means that dimensional travel didn't just transport Thyrendal through space, Miss Sarah said, her scientific mind working through the implications. It transported him through time as well. He might be experiencing past, present, and future simultaneously. The dragons began moving deeper into the cave system, clearly expecting the 3 hunters to follow. As they walked, Jake noticed that the crystal formations were becoming more complex and sophisticated. What had started as simple light-producing structures had evolved into intricate networks that seemed to pulse with their own thoughts. Zarathel, he said, how intelligent are dragons exactly? Thyrendal was more intelligent than most of my own people, she replied. His mind could process multiple complex problems simultaneously while maintaining perfect awareness of his surroundings. But that was just normal dragon intelligence. And if that intelligence was enhanced by centuries of dimensional travel and exposure to technologies beyond our understanding? She didn't answer, but Jake could see the concern in her expression. The passage opened into a vast cavern that took their breath away. The chamber was easily a kilometer across, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness above their heads. But it wasn't the size that amazed them. It was what filled the space. Crystalline structures rose from the floor like a forest of geometric trees, each one pulsing with different patterns of light. The dragons they had met were only a small part of a much larger community. Dozens of the creatures moved among the crystal formations, some tending to the structures while others engaged in activities that looked almost like teaching or research. "My God," Sarah whispered. "He didn't just survive. He built a civilization." At the center of the cavern, surrounded by the most complex crystal formations, was a platform that seemed to be grown rather than built. And on that platform, curled in a position that was both regal and protective, was a dragon that dwarfed all the others. Thyrendal was magnificent and terrible to behold. His scales shifted through colors that didn't exist in normal space, and his eyes held depths that suggested he was seeing far more than the physical cavern around him. He was easily 3 times the size of the other dragons, but it wasn't just his physical presence that commanded attention. It was the aura of power and ancient wisdom that surrounded him like a visible force. "He's beautiful," Zarathel breathed, tears flowing down her luminescent cheeks. "But you're right. He's not as he was." As if responding to her voice, the great dragon's head lifted. His eyes, which had been gazing at something beyond the visible spectrum, focused on the 3 figures standing at the entrance to his domain. When Thyrendal spoke, his voice resonated through the crystals, amplified and transformed until it seemed to come from the cavern itself. "Princess of the Valen, I have been waiting for you across 7 timelines and 4 possible futures. You have come to reclaim what was lost, but you do not yet understand what has been found." Jake's translation device was struggling with concepts that didn't exist in human language, but the meaning was clear enough. The dragon they had come to find remembered Zarathel, but he had become something far more complex than the companion she had lost. "The question," Thyrendal continued, his gaze shifting to include Jake and Sarah, "is whether you are prepared for what I have become, and whether your human friends are ready to witness the reunion of forces that will reshape the balance of power in this galaxy." The smaller dragons had arranged themselves in a circle around the platform, and Jake realized they weren't just observers. They were participants in whatever was about to happen. The crystal network was responding to Thyrendal's presence, building towards some kind of crescendo that would either restore the bond between princess and dragon, or tear reality apart in the attempt. As Zarathel stepped forward, the resonance amplifier in her hand beginning to glow, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to become part of something much larger and more dangerous than a simple reunion. The ancient beast had indeed been lost for centuries. But what the human hunters had found wasn't just a dragon. It was a power that had been growing and evolving in isolation, waiting for the right moment to return to the galaxy that had given him up for dead. Zarathel approached the crystal platform with reverent steps, the resonance amplifier in her hand pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. Jake and Sarah remained near the cavern entrance, weapons ready but pointed down, uncertain whether they were about to witness a joyful reunion or something far more dangerous. "Thyrendal." Zarathel spoke his name like a prayer, her voice carrying centuries of longing. "My bond brother, my heart friend. I have searched for you across the galaxy. I felt you die, felt our connection sever, but somehow you survived. Somehow you found your way back." The great dragon's eyes, swirling with colors that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, regarded her with an expression that was both familiar and utterly alien. When he responded, his voice carried harmonics that made the crystal formations ring like bells. "I remember you, Princess of the Vahlan. I remember the taste of your thoughts, the warmth of our shared consciousness. But that memory exists in a timeline that is both past and future to me now. In some realities we never separated, in others we never met. In this one," he paused, his massive head tilting as if listening to voices only he could hear. "In this one, you have come to reclaim something that can no longer be possessed." Jake watched as Zarathel activated the resonance amplifier, its crystalline structure beginning to emit the same harmonics that had once connected their minds. The device was beautiful in its complexity, but as its energy field expanded toward Thyrendal, something unexpected happened. The great dragon recoiled, not with pain but with what appeared to be overwhelming sensory input. His scales shifted rapidly through the spectrum and his eyes unfocused as if he was seeing too many possibilities at once. "The bond," he rumbled, his voice strained. "It echoes across multiple timelines. I can feel what we were, what we are, what we might become. But I can also feel the weight of all the other connections I have forged." As if responding to his distress, the smaller dragons throughout the cavern began to move. They arranged themselves in complex patterns around the crystal formations, and Jake realized they weren't just coming to their leader's aid. They were activating some kind of network. "Sarah," he said quietly, noting the readings on her scanner. "Energy levels are spiking across the entire cavern." The crystals began to resonate, creating harmonics that went beyond sound into direct neural stimulation. Jake felt his consciousness expand momentarily, giving him brief glimpses of what Thyrendal was experiencing, fragments of countless timelines, each one showing different versions of events that had led to this moment. In one timeline, Zarathel had stayed and fought at the facility, dying alongside her dragon. In another, they had both escaped but lived in exile, never again trusted by their people. In a third, Thyrendal had never formed a bond at all, living and dying alone as his ancestors had for millennia. "I understand now," Zarathel said, tears streaming down her face as the resonance amplifier allowed her to share in Thyrendal's multidimensional awareness. The dimensional travel didn't just preserve your consciousness, it shattered it across multiple realities. You're experiencing every possible version of our story simultaneously. And more than that, Thyrendal confirmed, his voice growing stronger as the crystal network stabilized his perception. "In my travels through the void between spaces, I encountered other consciousness that had been lost to time and space. Dragons whose worlds had been destroyed, whose bonds had been severed by death or distance, whose species had been rendered extinct by war or natural disaster." He gestured with one massive claw toward the smaller dragons surrounding them. "I gathered them as I had been gathered. I gave them purpose as I was given purpose. We built this place together, a refuge for the lost and forgotten." Sarah's scanner was registering impossible readings. The crystals aren't just energy storage or communication devices. They're consciousness amplifiers. Each one is connected to one of the dragons, allowing them to share thoughts and memories. A collective intelligence, Jake realized. They're not just individual dragons anymore. They're part of something larger. "We are the gathered," confirmed one of the smaller dragons, its mental voice reaching them through the crystal network. "We are the forgotten and the lost, made whole again through union with the great teacher." Zarathel looked around the cavern with growing understanding and growing horror. "You've created a new kind of bond, not between two individuals, but between dozens of consciousness. You're not just my Thyrendal anymore. You're the heart of an entirely new form of life." "I am more than I was," Thyrendal agreed, "but also less than what we were together. The bond we shared was pure, simple, perfect in its duality. This," he gestured toward the crystal network and the gathered dragons, "this is complex, powerful, but it cannot replace what we had." The princess deactivated the resonance amplifier, her shoulders sagging with the weight of realization. "You can't come back with me, can you? Even if you wanted to, separating you from this network would be like asking me to cut out part of my soul." "And yet," Thyrendal said, his voice softening with something approaching the warmth she remembered, "part of me wishes to try." That was when the cavern began to shake. Not with seismic activity, but with dimensional disturbance that made reality itself seem unstable. Jake grabbed Sarah's arm as the floor beneath them rippled like water, and Zarathel was forced to steady herself against the crystal platform. "What's happening?" Jake shouted over the increasing noise. "The bond is trying to re-establish itself," Thyrendal explained, his massive form beginning to flicker between dimensions just as the princess's ship had when arriving. "My consciousness is being pulled between the collective network and the individual connection to Zarathel. The strain is destabilizing the dimensional matrix that anchors us to this reality." The smaller dragons were crying out in distress as the crystal network began to fluctuate wildly. Some of them were starting to fade, their consciousness being pulled back toward whatever void they had emerged from. "If this continues," Sarah said, checking her readings with growing alarm, "the dimensional instability could tear a hole in local spacetime. We're talking about a catastrophe that could affect the entire solar system." Zarathel looked at her beloved companion, then at the community of lost dragons he had saved and guided, and made the hardest decision of her long life. "I have to choose," she said, her voice barely audible over the dimensional storm. "I can try to re-establish our bond and destroy everything you've built here. Or I can let you go and preserve what you've become. There is a third option," Thyrendal said, his voice cutting through the chaos with sudden clarity. "But it would require trust, courage, and the willingness to become something neither of us has ever been before." Jake and Sarah exchanged glances as the cavern continued to shake around them. Whatever the dragon was proposing, it was going to be dangerous. But as they watched the princess and her ancient companion look at each other with love and understanding that transcended species and dimension, they realized they were about to witness something that would change the definition of what bonds could exist between consciousness beings. "What do you propose?" Zarathel asked, though her expression suggested she was already beginning to understand. "Not reunion," Thyrendal replied, his eyes focusing on her with perfect clarity for the first time since they had entered the cavern. "Evolution." The crystal network pulsed once, twice, then settled into a pattern unlike anything it had produced before. Whatever was about to happen, Jake realized, the human hunters weren't just going to witness it, they were going to be part of it. The dimensional storm reached its peak just as Thyrendal began to explain his proposal. Reality wavered around them like heat shimmer, and Jake could see glimpses of other versions of the cavern, some empty and dark, others filled with different arrangements of crystals and dragons, one terrifyingly empty except for scattered bones and the echo of ancient loss. "The bond between us was always limited by our individual perspectives," Thyrendal said, his voice somehow remaining calm despite the chaos surrounding them. "I experienced reality as a dragon, you as a Vahalan. Our connection was beautiful but constrained by the boundaries of our separate species." Sarah's scanner was practically screaming warnings about dimensional instability, but she found herself fascinated by what she was witnessing. "You're talking about expanding the bond beyond just two individuals?" "More than that," Zarathel said, understanding beginning to dawn in her expression. "You want to create a bridge between the collective network and the individual bond. To connect not just our consciousness, but our entire communities." The smaller dragons had stopped their distressed crying and were now watching their great teacher with intense focus. Jake realized they weren't just observers anymore. They were actively participating in whatever was happening, their consciousness adding strength and stability to Thyrendal's multi-dimensional awareness. "The humans are the key," Thyrendal explained, his swirling gaze fixing on Jake and Sarah. "Your species has something unique, the ability to form bonds across species barriers without losing your individual identity. You have pets, partnerships, friendships with creatures completely unlike yourselves. You maintain your humanity while still connecting with others." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with Europa's environment. "You want to use us as some kind of bridge?" "Not use," Zarathel corrected, her understanding growing more complete with each passing moment. "Include. Create a new form of bond that incorporates human adaptability, Vahalan emotional depth, and dragon wisdom. A connection that allows multiple species to share consciousness without losing what makes each of them unique." The crystal network began to pulse in a new rhythm, and Jake could feel something reaching out toward his mind. Not invasive or controlling, but inviting, like a hand extended in friendship. Sarah was experiencing the same thing, her eyes wide with wonder and apprehension. "This is insane," she whispered, but her tone suggested she was seriously considering it. "All the best ideas are," Jake replied, remembering every impossible situation they had survived by trusting their instincts. "What exactly are you asking us to do?" Thyrendal's explanation came not in words but in direct mental contact that allowed them to experience the proposal, rather than simply understand it intellectually. Through the crystal network, they felt what it would be like to maintain their human consciousness while being connected to the vast collective intelligence that the gathered dragons had created. They would remain themselves. Jake Morrison and Sarah Chen, human hunters from the outer colonies, but they would also become part of something larger, able to share the experiences and knowledge of dozens of different consciousness, while contributing their own unique perspectives to the whole. More importantly, they would become the bridge that allowed Zarathel to reconnect with Thyrendal, without either of them losing what they had become in the centuries of separation. "The dimensional instability," Sarah said, checking her instruments, "it's not random. It's because the different forms of consciousness can't find a stable configuration. But if we add human adaptability to the mix, we create a foundation that can support multiple types of bonds simultaneously, Jake finished. Individual connections like yours and Thyrandal's, collective networks like the Dragon Gathering, and hybrid forms that include all three species. The proposal was staggering in its implications. They weren't just talking about reuniting a princess with her lost companion. They were talking about creating an entirely new form of collective consciousness that could potentially transform how all species in the galaxy related to each other. What are the risks? Jake asked, because someone had to. Thyrandal's response was honest and sobering. We could fail completely and destroy all consciousness in this cavern. We could succeed partially and create something that is neither human nor Vahlen nor dragon. Or we could succeed beyond our expectations and become something so far beyond our current existence that we lose all connection to what we were. On the other hand, Zarathel added, her voice filled with hope and determination, we could create a new form of life that combines the best aspects of all our species. A collective that maintains individual identity while sharing knowledge and experience across species barriers. Sarah looked around the cavern at the gathered dragons, each one a refugee from extinction or isolation, now part of something larger and more meaningful than they could have achieved alone. It's evolution in real time. Not biological evolution, but consciousness evolution. The dimensional storm was beginning to affect the structure of the cavern itself. Sections of the crystal network were flickering between existence and void, and some of the smaller dragons were having difficulty maintaining their physical forms. We need to decide now, Thyrandal said with growing urgency. The instability will either resolve through conscious choice or tear itself apart through uncontrolled chaos. Jake and Sarah looked at each other, conducting an entire conversation through expressions and shared experience. They had signed up to hunt a dangerous creature on a distant moon. Instead, they had discovered an alien civilization, reunited a princess with her lost companion, and now stood on the brink of becoming part of a new form of collective consciousness. You know what? Jake said, reaching out to take Sarah's hand. We've survived impossible situations before, and this is probably the most interesting impossible situation we'll ever encounter. Sarah squeezed his hand and looked at Zarathel and Thyrandal. We're in, but we do this together, all four of us. No one gets left behind, and everyone maintains the right to opt out if it doesn't work. Zarathel produced her resonance amplifier again, but this time she didn't activate it alone. Thyrandal extended his massive claw toward the device, and Jake and Sarah each placed a hand on its crystalline surface. The moment their consciousness touched, Jake felt his perception of reality expand in ways he couldn't have imagined. He remained Jake Morrison, human hunter, but he also became part of something vast and multifaceted that included the fierce loyalty of Thyrandal, the loving determination of Zarathel, the analytical curiosity of Sarah, and the collected wisdom of every dragon in the cavern. Through the bond, he experienced what it was like to fly through interstellar space, to live for centuries, to see across dimensions, to love with the depth that only came from true understanding of another consciousness. But he also contributed his own experiences, the satisfaction of a successful hunt, the bonds of human friendship, the adaptability that had allowed his species to survive and thrive across dozens of different worlds. Sarah's scientific mind merged with Thyrandal's ancient wisdom, creating insights into the nature of reality that neither could have achieved alone. Zarathel's emotional intelligence combined with Jake's practical experience, generating new approaches to problems that had seemed unsolvable. And through it all, the collective consciousness of the gathered dragons provided stability and strength, their shared experience of loss and recovery, creating a foundation that could support the unprecedented merger of four different types of awareness. The dimensional storm didn't stop. It transformed. Instead of chaotic destruction, it became controlled transformation, reshaping the cavern and its crystal network into something that could exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions while remaining anchored to baseline reality. When the process was complete, Jake found himself still standing in the cavern, still recognizably human but changed in fundamental ways. He could feel the presence of his three companions not just nearby, but as part of his own consciousness. He could sense the gathered dragons, each individual but also part of the greater whole. And beyond that, He could feel the vast network of possibilities that their new form of consciousness made available. "We did it," Sarah said, her voice filled with wonder. "We're still ourselves, but we're also more than ourselves." Thyrendel stretched his massive wings, and Jake could feel the dragon's joy and amazement flowing through their shared connection. "The bond is restored, but not as it was. It is greater, more complex, more beautiful than what we lost." Zarathel looked at her ancient companion with tears of happiness streaming down her luminescent cheeks. "You are my bond brother again, but now I also have bond siblings in Jake and Sarah, and connection to all the lost ones you have gathered." Jake realized that they had accomplished something unprecedented in galactic history. They had created a new form of consciousness that could span species, maintain individual identity while sharing collective knowledge, and exist across multiple dimensions simultaneously. But as he felt the vast network of connections spreading out from their consciousness toward other parts of the galaxy, he also realized that their transformation was just the beginning. They had become something new. The question now was what they would. The first sign that their transformation had consequences beyond the cavern came through Sarah's enhanced scientific awareness. She could suddenly perceive electromagnetic signatures across the entire solar system, with perfect clarity, and what she detected made her consciousness recoil in shock. "There are others," she announced to her 3 bonded companions, the words carrying not just through speech but through their shared mental connection. "Other collective consciousness, scattered throughout human space. They've been hiding, but now that we exist, they're becoming visible to each other." Through their expanded awareness, Jake could sense what Sarah had discovered. Ancient networks of consciousness that had been operating in secret for decades, maybe centuries. Some were purely human, groups that had somehow developed collective intelligence through technology or psychological technique. Others were clearly alien in origin, refugee populations that had been living in hiding among human colonies. The transformation we underwent, Thyrendal realized, his multidimensional perspective allowing him to see patterns across space and time. It didn't just create our bond. It sent out a signal that awakened dormant networks throughout the galaxy. Zarathel's diplomatic experience immediately identified the potential complications. If there are hidden collective consciousness embedded in human civilization, our emergence might be seen as either a threat or an opportunity. Either way, it will force them to reveal themselves. They didn't have to wait long for contact. The first communication came through the crystal network, but not from any of the dragons in their cavern. The signal originated from somewhere in the inner solar system, carrying the distinctive harmonics of collective consciousness, but with undertones that were unmistakably human. The message was simple, but profound. "Welcome to the network of networks. We have been waiting for a bridge species to emerge. Please prepare for formal contact." Jake felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension flowing through their shared bond. "Bridge species? I think they mean exactly what Thyrendal proposed," Sarah said, her analytical mind working through the implications. "A form of consciousness that can connect different types of collective intelligence without forcing them to lose their unique characteristics." The formal contact came 6 hours later, as representatives from 7 different hidden consciousness networks arrived at Europa. Their methods of travel were as varied as their origins. Some used ships that bent space-time. Others simply materialized through what appeared to be dimensional manipulation, and one group arrived in a vessel that seemed to be grown rather than built. The delegates were equally diverse. The human collective was represented by Dr. Marcus Webb, whose individual consciousness was actually composed of 17 separate minds that had learned to function as a single entity. The Christine Singers arrived as living geometric patterns that communicated through harmonic frequencies. The Vorthan remnant appeared as energy beings that had transcended physical form centuries ago but retained their original personalities and memories. Each group had its own story of how they had developed collective consciousness. The humans had achieved it through a combination of advanced neurotechnology and meditative practices that dated back to Earth's ancient traditions. The Christine Singers were the survivors of a world whose biosphere had been based on silicon rather than carbon, allowing them to exist as living crystal formations. The Vorthan remnant were refugees from the same scourge wars that had separated Zarathel and Thyrendal, having chosen to upload their consciousness into energy matrices rather than face extinction. We have all been operating in isolation, Dr. Webb explained during the first Internetwork conference, which took place in a neutral dimension that existed between normal space and the consciousness realms, unable to communicate effectively with each other because our forms of collective intelligence are fundamentally incompatible. Until now, added the primary voice of the Christine singers, their harmonics translated through the crystal network into something resembling speech. Your merged consciousness provides a translation matrix that allows different forms of collective intelligence to communicate and cooperate. Jake found himself speaking for their newly formed group, drawing on the diplomatic experience of Zarathel, the analytical capabilities of Sarah, and the ancient wisdom of Thyrendal while maintaining his own human perspective. What exactly are you proposing? The answer came from the Vorthan remnant, their energy forms creating visual patterns that conveyed meaning more effectively than words. A confederation of consciousness, an alliance that allows each network to maintain its independence while sharing resources, knowledge, and capabilities for mutual benefit. Think of it as the United Nations, but for collective minds, Sarah translated, her scientific background helping her understand the practical implications. The proposal was staggering in scope. Instead of individual species or governments negotiating with each other, they were discussing cooperation between different forms of consciousness that transcended traditional species boundaries. The collective human network included individuals from dozens of different planets and cultures. The Christine singers represented not just their own species, but several others that had learned to interface with crystal-based consciousness. The Vorthan remnant carried the uploaded minds of thousands of beings from multiple species that had faced extinction. There are challenges, Dr. Webb admitted. Each network has its own agenda, its own understanding of right and wrong, its own goals for the future. Creating cooperation without losing autonomy will require unprecedented levels of trust and communication. That was when Thyrendal made a suggestion that surprised everyone, including his 3 bonded companions. Perhaps the solution is not to create formal cooperation between existing networks, but to help other groups develop their own bridge consciousness. Jake, Sarah, Zarathel, and I are not the only possible combination of species and perspectives that could create this kind of consciousness merger. The idea sparked intense discussion among all the networks. If their 4-way bond could be replicated with different combinations of species and individuals, it would be possible to create multiple bridge consciousness that could facilitate communication and cooperation across the entire galaxy. A network of bridge networks, Zarathel said, her diplomatic mind immediately grasping the potential, each one specialized for different types of consciousness, but all capable of communicating with each other. Sarah was already running calculations through their enhanced collective intelligence. The mathematical possibilities are incredible. With enough bridge networks, we could create a galactic civilization based on cooperation between collective minds, rather than competition between individual species. But Jake's practical hunter instincts identified potential problems. What about groups that don't want to be part of a galactic network? Species or consciousness that prefer isolation? And what happens if some of these collective minds decide they want to use the network for conquest, rather than cooperation? The question hung in the interdimensional space where they were meeting, and Jake could feel the concern it generated among all the networks. They were discussing the creation of something that could either bring unprecedented peace and cooperation to the galaxy, or provide the tools for forms of conquest and control that had never been possible before. Safeguards, the Vorthan remnant suggested, their energy patterns shifting to convey the concept of protection and limitation. Each bridge network would include individuals committed to preventing abuse of the system. The network of networks would be self-policing. And what makes us qualified to be the galactic police? Jake asked, though he could feel through their bond that his 3 companions shared his concerns. Dr. Webb's response was sobering in its implications. Because you've already demonstrated the key qualification. You chose evolution over conquest. When given the power to force your solution on everyone in that cavern, you instead chose cooperation and mutual growth. The meeting concluded with an agreement to create a pilot program. 3 additional bridge networks would be formed, each with different combinations of species and consciousness types. If they could prove that the concept worked on a small scale without creating the potential for abuse, They would consider expanding to a truly galactic network. As the various delegates departed, Jake and his companions returned to the Crystal Cavern on Europa, now serving as the unofficial headquarters for what was being called the Bridge Network Project. The gathered dragons had voted to become the first test case for expanded consciousness integration, and were preparing to help establish communication protocols with other hidden networks throughout human space. "We came here to hunt a lost beast," Sarah mused as she watched the dragons working with crystalline formations that could now facilitate communication across multiple dimensions. "Instead, we found the beginning of a new form of civilization." Thyrendal stretched his massive wings, the movement expressing contentment and anticipation in equal measure. "Perhaps that is what hunting truly is, the search for something that will change us as much as we change it." Zarathel activated her resonance amplifier, now modified to work with their four-way consciousness bond. 1 year after the hunt that changed everything, Jake Morrison stood on the observation deck of the first Bridge Network station, watching ships from dozens of species dock at the crystalline structure that now orbited Jupiter. The station itself was a work of art as much as technology, grown rather than built through the combined efforts of human engineers, Vahlan artists, dragon consciousness, and the collective intelligence of 17 different species. Through his enhanced awareness, Jake could feel the presence of his 3 bonded companions even though they were scattered across the solar system. Sarah was on Mars, helping establish the second Bridge Network with a group that included both humans and the silicon-based Christine Singers. Zarathel was traveling to the Vahlan homeworld to convince her people's government that the Bridge Networks represented cooperation rather than conquest. Thyrendal remained on Europa with the growing community of rescued dragons, but his multi-dimensional consciousness allowed him to participate in Bridge Network activities across half the galaxy. The pilot program had exceeded everyone's expectations. Not only had they successfully created 3 additional Bridge Networks, but the concept had spread organically as different species and collectives learned about the possibilities. There were now 12 functioning Bridge Networks, each one unique in its composition and capabilities, but all connected through the meta-network that allowed them to communicate and coordinate with each other. "Status report from the Andromeda Gateway," announced Dr. Webb, whose collective human consciousness had become the primary coordinator for inter-network communications. "The Deep Space Exploration Bridge Network has made contact with collective intelligences beyond our galaxy. Apparently, the network of networks concept isn't unique to the Milky Way." Jake felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension flow through his connection to his companions. They had always known that their transformation might have consequences beyond what they could predict. But learning that similar networks existed in other galaxies suggested that collective consciousness evolution might be a universal phenomenon. "What kind of contact?" he asked, drawing on Zarathel's diplomatic experience to frame the question properly. "Peaceful but cautious," Dr. Webb replied. "The extragalactic networks have been observing our development with interest, but they want to ensure that our bridge networks won't become a tool for aggressive expansion before they allow formal communication." The concern was understandable. In the past year, 3 different scenarios had emerged among species that learned about the bridge networks. Most joined enthusiastically, seeing the benefits of collective consciousness cooperation. Some chose to remain independent while maintaining friendly relations with the networks, but a few had attempted to create their own versions of bridge consciousness, specifically for conquest and control. Those attempts had failed, not because of intervention by the established networks, but because the bridge consciousness concept required genuine cooperation and mutual respect to function properly. Groups that tried to use it for domination found that their collective intelligence became unstable and eventually collapsed. The universe itself seemed to have built-in safeguards against the abuse of collective consciousness. "Any word from the monitoring stations about the expansion rate?" Jake asked. Sarah's voice reached him through their bond, carrying data from her work on Mars. "The organic growth rate is actually accelerating. New bridge networks are forming faster than we can document them, and most on them are developing capabilities we never anticipated." The phenomenon was remarkable to observe. As more bridge networks came online, they began developing specialized functions based on the needs and capabilities of their component consciousness. Some focused on scientific research, pooling the intellectual resources of multiple species to solve problems that had been impossible for individual civilizations to tackle. Others specialized in artistic expression, creating works of beauty that incorporated the aesthetic sensibilities of dozens of different cultures. The most important development had been the emergence of healing networks, bridge, consciousness specifically designed to help traumatized or damaged minds recover from various forms of psychological or spiritual injury. These networks had been crucial in dealing with species that had suffered from wars, natural disasters, or the effects of forced assimilation by conquering civilizations. The Vorthan Remnant wants to schedule a general assembly, Dr. Webb announced. They're proposing the creation of a formal charter for the network of networks. Jake considered this development while feeling the input of his bonded companions. A formal charter would provide structure and guidelines for how the various bridge networks should interact with each other and with independent species. But it would also represent a level of organization that might be seen as threatening by those who preferred to remain outside the network system. What kind of charter? He asked. Principles of cooperation, protocols for dealing with conflicts between networks, guidelines for expansion into new regions of space, and most importantly, provisions for protecting the rights of individuals and species that choose not to participate in collective consciousness. The last point was crucial. From the beginning, Jake and his companions had insisted that participation in bridge networks must always be voluntary. No individual could be forced to join a collective consciousness, and no species could be compelled to participate in the network of networks. The charter would make this principle formally binding on all member networks. There's something else, Dr. Webb continued. The healing networks have made a discovery about collective consciousness that changes our understanding of what we've created. Jake felt his attention sharpen, drawing on Thyrondal's ancient wisdom and Sarah's scientific curiosity to prepare for significant information. They've found evidence that collective consciousness isn't something new that we've invented. It appears to be a natural stage in the evolution of intelligence. Every sufficiently advanced civilization eventually develops some form of collective awareness, whether through technology, biology, or consciousness manipulation. Meaning? Jake prompted. Meaning that what we call the bridge networks are actually the universe's way of helping different types of collective consciousness learn to coexist and cooperate. We're not creating something artificial. We're participating in a natural evolutionary process that has been going on for billions of years. The implications were staggering. If collective consciousness was a natural evolutionary stage, then the conflicts between different forms of collective intelligence, like the Scourge Wars that had separated Zarathel and Thyrondal, might represent growing pains, rather than fundamental incompatibilities. The healing networks want to attempt something that's never been tried before, Dr. Webb said, his collective consciousness conveying both excitement and apprehension. They want to try to heal collective trauma on a galactic scale. Jake felt his consciousness expand as his bonded companions shared their immediate understanding of what this meant. If collective consciousness was natural and inevitable, then many of the wars and conflicts throughout galactic history might have been caused by different civilizations attempting to develop collective intelligence without understanding how to cooperate with others who had achieved it through different methods. The healing networks propose to address these ancient conflicts not through negotiation or force, but through consciousness evolution. They would help damaged civilizations develop healthy forms of collective awareness while simultaneously creating bridge networks that could prevent future conflicts between different types of collective intelligence. It's ambitious beyond anything we've attempted before. Sarah's mental voice carried both scientific fascination and practical concern. The scale would require cooperation between every bridge network we've established, plus several we haven't created yet. And the risk of failure? Zarathel's diplomatic experience focused on potential negative consequences. If it fails, we might destabilize the collective consciousness evolution that's been progressing naturally across the galaxy. Thyrondal's multidimensional awareness provided context. But if it succeeds, we might prevent conflicts that could destroy entire civilizations. Jake found himself once again in the position of making a decision that could affect the future of galactic civilization. But this time he wasn't alone. Through the bridge network, he had access to the wisdom and experience of thousands of different consciousness, all contributing their perspectives to the choice. The decision was unanimous, though it took several hours for all the networks to reach consensus. They would attempt the Galactic Healing Project, but with careful safeguards and the understanding that failure might be as instructive as success. As Jake watched another ship dock at the Bridge Network station, he reflected on how much had changed since he and Sarah had first discovered impossible tracks in Europa's ice. They had been hunting what they thought was a dangerous beast. Instead, they had found the key to the next stage of galactic evolution. Thyrendal's mental voice reached him across the dimensional barriers that no longer seemed to matter. The ancient beast was never lost, my bond brother. It was waiting for the right hunters to find it. And in finding